Hi, today we're going to do a special review of the Nikon D810. Now, you can find lots and lots of reviews of this camera, which was announced in June last year. What we want to do is compare this camera to a semi-professional camera like the Nikon D7100, which we have been using for several years. Now, there are several differences between the two cameras. There are disadvantages and advantages to both of them, and we are going to look at the design, the operation, the menus. We're going to look at performance, and finally we're going to look at the value of the two cameras and to whom each camera is actually intended for. So let's start by looking at the design, the functionality, and some of the menus of both cameras. Okay, so now let's have a look at the design and the build quality of both cameras. Now, in terms of build quality, the build quality of both cameras is very, very high. In terms of design, they're pretty similar. Obviously, the Nikon D810 on this side is much larger and also heavier. It's about 200 grams heavier than the D7100, and you can feel it when you hold both cameras. Now, in terms of the grip, the D810 has a slightly deeper grip than the D7100, but it's not a huge difference. In terms of the location of the bottoms on the front, it's not very different. As you can see, you have both bottoms here closer to each other. On the D7100 they're a bit further away, but other than that the design of the front part of the cameras is very, very similar. On the D810 you have connectors for a wired flash here on the front, which you don't have on the D7100. So maybe professional photographers who use wired flash can enjoy this connectors, but we didn't find them useful, at least whenever we shot with the D7100. Let's look at the upper part of both cameras. This is the D7100 and this is the D810. Now, again, we don't have a lot of differences here. You do have on the D810, you have a mode button here next to the video record button, which you don't have on the D7100. The reason for that is that on this side you have a dial which you don't have on the D7100. On the D7100 you have the mode dial, which we actually prefer to this dial that controls either the ISO, the white balance, or the image quality, etc. So you know, it's a matter of personal preference, but all professional cameras from Nikon has this dedicated dial with the mode button instead of the mode dial. So again, it's a different way of doing things. We prefer this way. If you're a professional photographer, maybe you got accustomed to this way of controlling your white balance, etc. So let's have a look at the back of both cameras. So again, this is the D7100 and this is the D810. Now the cameras, again, pretty similar. On this side you have on the D810 you have the I button, which you don't have here on the D7100. You also have the OK button, which doesn't exist here. It just exists on the joystick, which you also have on the D810. Another difference is the AF on button, which you don't have on the D7100. You only have the AEL and the AFL button, which you can reassign to use for autofocusing on the D7100, and we are doing this. Is very, very useful. On the D810 you don't have to reassign the AEL and AFL button. You simply assign the AF on button for focusing. Now, another big difference between the two cameras is obviously the viewfinder. The viewfinder on the D810 is much larger, much brighter than the one that you can find on the D7100, and this is partly because you also have a bigger sensor. So this is a big difference. The eyepiece itself is different. We prefer the round one that you have on the D810 to the one that you have on the D7100, but you know, it's simply a different shape and of course a different size. Now let's have a look at the screen. Both screens are 3-inch 1.2 million dot resolution screens. They're not tiltable or any other thing. They're also not touch screens, both of them. The only difference that you can see is that on the D810 you have the screen protector, which you don't find on the D7100. Now, we're getting this question a lot, you know, how can I find a screen protector for the D7100? Well, you don't need one. And the reason is that you have some sort of a protective layer on the screen of the D7100. And about 2 years ago, we were talking to a Nikon representative, and he gave us a demonstration, actually pretty convincing one. He took a key and actually keyed the screen very strongly, and nothing happened to the screen. Now, this was not a one-time thing. We actually used this camera for over 2 years, and this camera has been through quite a bit, and nothing happened to the screen. We can't see any scratches to the screen or anything else. Now, we don't know what's going on with the screen of the D810. Is it the same screen exactly? Maybe not, maybe yes, we don't know. Nikon doesn't advertise this property of the screen, the protection. They don't say if this is Gorilla Glass or something else. We don't know, but at least on the D7100 it does work, we can tell you that. On the D810, again, maybe it exists, maybe it doesn't, but you do have this screen protector, which you can of course take off. So this is another difference. A difference that has nothing to do with both cameras, we're going to talk about this in a second, has to do with using or actually controlling the aperture during either live view or video shooting, but we're going to talk about this in a second. Let's go on from here and talk about the menus, and there are quite a few differences between the menus of both cameras. So here we have the menu system for both cameras. Let's go into the main menu. Okay, so we're not going to go over all the menu items because you have so many on both cameras, and especially on the D810, but I do want to show you a few of the differences when you go to the most used menu, or the menu with the most items, which is the pencil menu. Let's go to, it's called the custom setting menu on both cameras. So as you can see, you have both on the D810 and on the D7100, you have A to G, and they have colors. So it's supposedly similar, but actually when you go into the sub-menus, you see that there are a lot of differences. So let's, for example, go into autofocus on both cameras. This is autofocus, and sorry, let's go into autofocus, and here you have on the D7100 you have the A1 to A7 options, and on the D810 you have A1 to this is A8, A9, A10, A11 and A12. So you can see that you have much more options, and if you go down you can see that again on the B menu you have on the D7100 5 options, and on the D810 you have 7, and this goes on throughout more or less the entire menu. So you have many more options to configure the D810. Now that said, we have to say that for the most part, at least for us, and maybe more professional photographers who need this very strong customization of the menu, might find the D810 menu useful in any way. We didn't find almost anything that we tried to do on the D7100 which we couldn't, and when we use the D810, the menu is simply very complicated. You really have to read the menu thoroughly to understand what each option does, and even then it's quite complicated to find things because there are so many options. Now, one thing that you do have on the D810 which you don't have on the D7100, which has basically nothing to do with the menu, has to do with controlling the exposure of both cameras using either live view or video modes. And this is something that we're going to repeat later on as this video, but basically when you're shooting with a lens which doesn't have an aperture ring, you can control the aperture during, again, either live view or video shooting with the D7100, and you can control it with the D810. Our workaround is simply to use older lenses for video shooting which do have aperture ring. So this is a drawback for the D7100, and this is something that Nikon might fix with the D7200, which is upcoming very shortly, hopefully. So this is a difference, and again, there are a lot of differences, small differences in terms of the menus, but for the most part, if you didn't feel, if you're using the D7100 and you didn't feel that you're missing anything, you're probably not going to find anything very useful in the D810. At least we didn't find anything, but you have a lot of options. One thing that we forgot in the previous section that you wanted to add, and that is the difference in terms of memory cards. Now on the D810 you have both CF card and an SD card. On the D7100, like more or less most of Nikon cameras, especially the medium, the mid-level and entry-level cameras, you have two SD cards, which is true for both the D7100, the D750, the D610 and D600. So Nikon uses the two SD card configuration quite a bit on its cameras. The lower end models have only one SD. Now we actually prefer the SD cards. We know that there are a lot of professional photographers who swear by their CF cards. They're more durable supposedly. We didn't find any problems with durability in terms of the actual physical card itself. There are obviously problems with cards breaking down internally or having internal problems, but in terms of actual durability, we didn't find any advantage to the CF cards. Actually, the other way around, the CF card, the card slot itself has pins which can break or somehow change position, and it's harder to actually put the card in its place. So we prefer the SD cards, and another advantage is that on the D7100 you have both cards which are the same, and on the D810 you need to buy two different card types. So if you want the dual type solution, one for video and one for stills, or one for backup or whatever, you have all sorts of options. You need to have two sets of different cards on the D810, while on the D7100 you have the same card, the same type of card. So this is an advantage. Another difference between the cameras, the D810 uses a USB 3 connector, which is obviously faster. It's also a different connector, while the D7100 uses a strange USB 2 connector. Actually, it's pretty hard to find the right connector. You get it, of course, with the camera itself, but let's say that you want to have a longer cable, you either need to use an extender, a USB extender, or find a different solution. We didn't find a long cable that fits the Nikon D7100. We also didn't find a 90 angle degree connector for the D7100, which is good if you're shooting video and you don't want your cable to be taken out very quickly. So this is a drawback of the D7100. As for the D810, well, we didn't use the USB connector that much, so we can't really say, but it's obviously faster. So these are two differences between the two cameras. Okay, so now we want to talk about the performance of the D810 versus the performance of the D7100. Let's start with looking at the continuous shooting speed. Now, the continuous shooting speed of the D7100 changes between 6 and 7 frames per second, depending on whether you're shooting in DX mode or a crop mode within the APS-C. which the Nikon D7000 is capable of, versus the D810, which gives you about 5 frames per second, which is something which increased versus the D800 and D800E, which only gave you 4 frames per second, but it's still slower than the D7100. Now, the big difference is not this. The big difference, when you actually look deeper into the numbers, is the difference between the buffers of the two cameras. Now, the D7100 officially only gives you 7 frames in the buffer when you're shooting 12-bit lossless RAW images. Now, if you look at the D810, the buffer was increased again versus the D800, the D800E to 47 frames. So this is a huge difference versus the D7100. It's really different beast, and this is one of the reasons why this is a professional level camera. It gives you the ability to shoot much more images sequentially. So this is one big difference. Another difference, and again, this is something that you don't necessarily see in the specifications of both cameras, is the autofocus. Now, both cameras use 51 autofocus points with 15 cross-type focus points. Now, the difference is the systems themselves. These are two different autofocus systems in the D7100 and the D810, and you actually see this in action. When we shot with both cameras with the same lenses, of course, we noticed that the D810 focuses much better and much faster, and more importantly, it focuses in situations where the D7100 actually struggles in lower light situations or when the focus subject was not very clear. So there is a big advantage to the D810 in this respect, and this is a very strong point of the D810, the very fast and accurate focusing of the camera. So there are two other important aspects of performance that we are going to look at in the terms of differences between the D7100 and the D810. Now, the first difference is the ISO, the sensitivity of both cameras. Now, as you would expect from a full-frame camera, the D810 gives you, and you can see some of our test images right now on the screen, about 1 to 1.5 times as much sensitivity as the D7100, and this especially you can see this especially when looking at images which are beyond 1600 ISO. So the Nikon D7100, at least in our subjective opinion, is good up to about 1600 ISO. You can shoot obviously above that, but we wouldn't really recommend shooting if you want very high quality images at anything above 1600 ISO. With the D810, this is of course different. You can shoot up to 3200 and even 6400 ISO is acceptable in some situations. Now, of course, the D810 is probably not the best Nikon camera in terms of sensitivity. We tested the Nikon DF, which has a much lower resolution than this camera, but performs better in terms of ISO. Now, this is a trade-off. If you have more megapixel, your sensitivity will usually be lower if you're talking about the same technology, sensor technology. Of course, when you move to better processors and better sensors, the performance can increase even with the higher megapixel. So this is one thing in terms of the resolution. Now, the second thing is in terms of the ISO. The second thing is the actual resolution, in which we touched upon this right now. The D810, just like the D800 and the D800E, has 36 megapixel, which is 1.5 times as much as the D7100, also as much as the D600, D610, and the D750. So this is a big difference. Now, if you want to understand how big is this difference, you can see some examples right now on the screen. D810 versus D7100 images, and you can see crop. The crop of the image in 100% in both cameras, and you can see the difference. There is quite a huge difference between the two. So this is a real advantage to the D810, but again, this is also true for the D800 and D800E. Now, with this high resolution comes it comes at a cost, and the cost, of course, is the size of the files. And the size of the files of the D810 is huge. They are very big, just like the D800 and D800E. And when you compare them to the D7100, you're talking about huge files, and you're going to need a very large hard drive. Now, the D810 has something which is really nice. Nikon calls it RAW-S. Canon had this for many years, which is basically small RAW files. In the Nikon D810 case, there are files of 9 megapixel resolution. So you have 36 megapixel and 9 megapixel RAW files. So if you want to still have the flexibility of RAW, but you don't want the large files, you can shoot at 9 megapixel. There are people who are saying that the small RAW implementation of Nikon is not perfect. They are not exactly like the 36 megapixel versions. We don't know, but from our test, you know, you can still play and have the same flexibility, or more or less the same flexibility as the larger files, of course with smaller capacity. So these are the differences that we have found in terms of performance between the two cameras. Now let's go to the conclusion and look at the value of both cameras. Okay, so we want to conclude this review, or actually the comparison between the D810 and the D7100, by talking at the advantages and disadvantages of having this camera, the D810, versus a semi-professional camera like the D7100. Now, as we said in the beginning, these are two very different beasts. The D810 is a professional level camera, while the D7100 is a semi-professional level camera. So what are the differences? Well, we've looked at all of them throughout this review, but first of all, of course, you have the different size sensor. In the D810 you have a full frame sensor, while on the D7100 you have a crop sensor. So this is one difference, and the implication of this difference is that you have better sensitivity, or better image quality, if you like, on the D810. This also has to do with the larger megapixel, or the larger resolution of the D810, which is 36 megapixel versus 24 on the D7100. So these are two important differences. The D810 is also very customizable. You have more buttons, you have different layout of buttons in the D810, which is in line with the professional configuration of buttons in the Nikon line of cameras. So this is another important difference. You have more menus, which you can also customize more on the D810. So this is another feature which the D810 has. The autofocus system on the D810, despite being 51 focus points and 15 cross-type points, just like the D7100, performs better on the D810 with the same lenses. So again, another advantage to the D810. Another important advantage which we have realized, and this is something that always bugged us when shooting with the D7100, is the ability to shoot with changed actually the aperture during video shooting. And this is something that you can't do with autofocus lenses which don't have the aperture ring on the D7100. On the D810 you can change the aperture during video shooting without any problems, as well as during live view. So this is a big advantage to the D810, and it's really a shame that Nikon doesn't implement this on lower level cameras actually. What we have found is that if you're shooting with lenses that do have an aperture ring, older Nikon cameras, you can change the aperture from the lens itself. So this is a sort of a workaround, if you like, for the D7100. So this is another difference. Another advantage to the D810 is the larger buffer. We're talking about 7 times the buffer that you have, maybe more, on the D810 versus the D7100. So you can shoot about almost 50 images until the buffer fills in the D810 versus about 7 officially, at least, on the Nikon D7100 on RAW. So another advantage to the D810. Now, what are the advantages of the D7100? Well, there are a few. First of all, the camera is much lighter and smaller. So this is again, a huge advantage unless you have bigger hands. In our case, we have smaller hands, so we prefer a body the size of the D7100. The D810 is simply too big for our hands, but it's a personal decision actually, and it's not something which is objective. So size is one thing. Weight is more objective than size, and we would say that the weight of the D810 is simply a bit too much for our taste at least. So this is a disadvantage of the D810. Now, pricing is of course very different between those two cameras. The D7010, the D7100 currently costs about $1,000. The D810 runs for about 3 times as much, about $3,000 in the US right now. So this is a huge price difference. We are about to see the D7200 being sold very soon, possibly even before this video will be up, but the price will still be very close to what we see now with the D7100. So you will still have a very big price difference between those two cameras. Now another thing which is an advantage, small advantage to the D7100 has to do with shooting speed or continuous shooting speed. You have 6 or 7 in the D7100 depending on what crop mode you're in, versus just 5 on the D810. But as we said, the buffer on the D810 is much bigger. So we're not sure if this is such a big advantage as it might seem. At the end of the day, if you really like full frame and you want to move from a semi-professional camera to a full frame camera, and you don't care to have such a large camera and spend so much money, and you can live without this 36 megapixel resolution that this camera offers, Nikon now has the D750. Now, by the time this video will be up, Nikon will probably fix the problem with the reflection that they had in the D750, so we will have no problem recommending it, and we are hoping to do a review of the camera later this year. But the D750 actually offers most of the capabilities of the D810 minus the resolution, with a smaller, cheaper, lighter body with, again, the same autofocus, the same image quality, more or less. Again, the different resolution might be a slight difference. But again, this is a very good option if you want to go full frame. You can read our full review or comparison of the two cameras, the D7100 and the D810 on LensVid.com.